sort of preview what we're going to see on week 2. But before we get to that, I just want your sort of take on what we saw week 1. I mean, was it what you expected?
Absolutely. So I think the state has methodically executed the plan they set out in opening statement. I think we're seeing it play out in a very successful way. I expect that next week we're going to see some use of force experts who are going to talk about that use of force was not justified in this case, which is chronologically in line with everything that the state said that they were going to produce for us to see.
Were there any witnesses that you think really stuck with the jury, or any particular moments that resonate in your mind that you think it's going to be hard for the jury to sort of look past or not carry with them emotionally?
You know, there's no question that the state was smart to front load this case with a lot of emotional energy. So as we get into use of force and some of the medical issues that are a lot more complicated, this jury is not going to forget how they felt when they heard from the bystanders and the people who don't have law degrees, who don't have badges, who don't have licenses of any kind, who told everyone what they saw that day, how they felt that day, and how they knew instinctively that it was wrong. And I think that that's something that's going to pay dividends when it comes to the jury making ultimate determinations in this case, is that the emotional energy that the state front loaded in this case is going to be everything.
I'm curious if your perspective has changed at all in terms of who has the easier road ahead. I know when we talked before the trial, you said that there's no such thing as an easy, open and shut case. Have you changed, or I mean, is this case closer to being a done deal perhaps than you initially thought as to how it's unfolded?
No, I think, you know, everything that we've seen, the state's done a tremendous job, and it's powerful, it's impactful. But let me say this about that. You know, at the end of the day, this is going to come down to expert testimony. It's going to come down to very detailed issues about use of force and a substantial cause of death. And none of those issues are going to be easy for this jury. So for everyone who thinks this is an easy verdict for the state or even for the defense would be wrong about that, because these are complicated issues that we haven't even begun to understand at this point. Because again, we've started off with all these emotional issues, which is good for the state. It's powerful in their presentation, but the rubber meets the road when we come down to those issues that actually impact this case. And it will turn on whether or not the substantial cause of death was in fact Chauvin's conduct in this case, or whether or not it had to do with drugs or any other medical issue that was outside the scope of his conduct.
Do you think the defense was successful in the line of questioning? I mean, anytime there was a mention of drugs, and I think the prosecution did an interesting job of bringing it up first, you know, laying it all out there, Floyd's drug use. But every time the drugs were brought up, or even when they weren't, it seems like the defense wanted to sort of pivot back and remind the jury about that. Were they successful in that, or is there a line they want to be careful not to cross with the jury in terms of putting the man who was killed on trial?
Well, I think everybody expected they would put, you know, George Floyd's character on trial here. I think no question they were trying to put his drug activity and certainly his behavior that day as a result of his drug activity in question, and so that it would justify the use of force. But the state did a lot by putting the girlfriend on and suggesting that, you know, this drug use was a struggle for him, and really getting in front of that in a way that empathized with him, empathized with his struggle with his drug use, rather than making him, you know, a person who was somebody who deserved this kind of conduct. It was somebody who was struggling with a lifelong addiction of opiates. His girlfriend and he struggled with it daily to try and get away from it. And so I really think that they did a lot in that area with the girlfriend coming forward. Now, the defense is going to continue to try and make that an issue, but I think that they're laying behind the log a little bit. They're trying to just go with the flow of the state with all these emotional victims, or witnesses, emotional witnesses who are coming forward. But at the end of the day, I think they know that their issues are much more nuanced. They're much more about use of force, and they're much more about the cause of death. And they set that out in their opening.
So Zimmerman was asked whether there was excessive use of force in this incident, and he said the force that was used was totally unnecessary. Prosecutor followed up, "What do you mean?" He responded, "Pulling him to the ground face down and putting your knee on the neck for that amount of time is just uncalled for. I saw no reason why the officers felt they were in danger." Prosecutor followed up, "In your opinion, should that restraint have stopped once he was handcuffed and prone on the ground?" His response was, absolutely. My question to you is how important was that moment, and how critical do you think that was to the defense? I mean, to the prosecution. How important and critical was that moment to the prosecution?
I think it was some of the most damning testimony we've heard so far, because he essentially said that I have 40 years of experience and this was totally unnecessary use of force. And whatever justification there was, it certainly did not extend to 9 minutes and 29 seconds, which plays into the opening statement from the state. And, coming from an expert in law enforcement, he simply found that it was just completely uncalled for, that there was no justification for the use of force. And that is one of the main issues that the jury is going to have to decide. And I think that Zimmerman did a lot to hurt the defensive theory that the crowd or anything else interfered with Chauvin's ability to execute his duties that day.
Does that really set the stage for what I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, will be an important witness probably Monday, if not Monday, Tuesday, when we hear from the chief of police who will testify against his former officer? Did Zimmerman really set the table for something similar we're going to hear from the top cop in Minneapolis?
No question. Zimmerman set the tone for what we're going to hear this week, which is a lot of experts who are going to say the use of force in this case is not justified, it's not consistent with policy, and there's absolutely no reason that it continued to occur after George Floyd was in cuffs, he was in custody, and he stopped resisting.
I want to ask you about a second moment, and that was when the jury heard for the first time from Chauvin himself, his voice in that body cam footage after the incident. You can hear him explain what he was thinking as he was talking to Mr. Charles McMillan, one of the witnesses who witnessed what happened. How unusual is that to hear from a police officer on a body cam? We may not hear from him in trial, but to hear his voice, to hear what he was thinking in that moment. You hear him say that this guy was rather large. He was a large man, and he seemed like he was on something, I think were his words. I'm paraphrasing here. But what role does that play with the jury in terms of hearing the defendant himself moments after the actual incident?
I mean, I think it plays a tremendous role. We may never hear from Chauvin, but it gives the jury a perspective about where he was coming from and what his mindset was that day. And it certainly wasn't reflective of what you and I might think is normal for an individual who was just part of, the death of another human being. And certainly somebody who played a significant role in that death. He didn't seem to express the kind of emotions that we would expect him to express given those circumstances.
So just follow up on that audio, you think did good for the prosecution? It hurt the defense?
No question. I mean, everything that the prosecution's presenting at this time is in line with everything they said they would do in opening statement to convince us that the use of force was unnecessary and that he caused the death of George Floyd that day.
Two more quick questions for you. Did the defense attorneys poke any holes? I know after day one, when we spoke for the first time, you said it was a pretty divided day. Prosecution had a strong opening, defense had a strong opening, and they'd been able to poke holes early on. As the week played out, do you think the defense was able to score points in certain places? And if so, could you talk about some of those?
Well, I think the defense is doing a good job of just being defensive to what is the prosecution's case at this time. I mean, they're going to have an opportunity to present their case, but in the meantime, they need to sit back and kind of let the state have their day. I do think that they did some impact in a couple of witnesses, but ultimately they've not been successful in pushing this theory that the officer's attention was divided as a result of the crowd. And I think that was a big deal as regards their use of force theory. And hopefully they're going to shift as things go on, because it hasn't played well. And I think the EMS workers alone kind of undermine any sense that anyone might have that divided attention might justify, you know, the abuse that occurred with George Floyd. They made very clear that they had a duty, that they executed that duty in that case, and that the crowd did not impact their ability to exercise a duty of care in that circumstance, which again puts to the police, why couldn't they do the same thing? So I think that the defensive theory, like any trial, is shifting as this trial is going forward, and I expect it to change as they get ready to put on their case. But I think the ultimate issue for them is going to be the substantial cause of death. And none of those issues are in front of the jury at this time. So they're just kind of hanging back and waiting for their moment and dealing with the witnesses that are presented at this time.
Do you think anything that happened during week one increases the chances that at this point that we might hear from Chauvin on the stand himself? Or I guess I think the way you put it last time was it has to be it'd be very unusual for him to testify. But what I've also seen in coverage is if it gets to a point where the defense thinks this may be our best shot, the jury to hear from himself, from the man himself about what was in his mind, they may. But did anything that happened during week one, in your mind, push the defense closer to maybe considering that?
I think so, definitely. I mean, the fact that the use of force issues are so strong in this case, and that the state has presented such compelling evidence that use of force was not necessary. I mean, the only way that the defense is going to overcome that at this point, since the crowd issue it's a non-starter, is to have the defendant get on the stand and talk about how he viewed it from his perspective, to give some level of understanding as to what he was going through, what he was thinking at that time, and why he would continue to leave his knee on the neck of this suspect as he was crying out for help.
Got it. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, any point that you want to get across from things you observed during week one? Anything I missed, or anything you want to say?
I mean, the only thing I would say is that this case will come down to expert testimony. It will come down to these detailed issues about use of force, substantial cause of death, and they're not easy issues. And the jury is going to have to reconcile those issues with all the emotional testimony we've heard so far.
Is it, in your experience dealing with jurors, is the emotion something that sometimes is difficult for jurors to get past? I mean, they're supposed to focus on these nitty-gritty issues, but you said it sort of earlier. That's why you want to get them tug at their heartstrings before you get to that point. Is that right?
Well, and primacy and recency is an issue in every trial, and the prosecutor's done a good job of putting in front of this jury those emotional issues on the front end. That said, you can get too much emotion, which tips in favor of the defense, where we're just exhausted by it. But in this particular case, as much as I think the state's done a great job of putting those emotions in front of this jury, again, those very difficult issues are going to be issues that the jury's going to struggle with, no matter how much emotion there has been so far, no matter how much they might empathize with George Floyd and his family and the people that were out there that day. These scientific and legal issues are going to be difficult. They would be for anyone to reconcile, as far as the conduct that happened that day, and then meeting their oath as jurors to follow the law and to render a verdict consistent with that law.
In a way, is what we're going to hear this week and maybe during week 3 legally perhaps more important than hearing from the bystanders and witnesses? Is this where the nitty-gritty part of the trial begins?
No question. I think the next week's going to be about use of force. The week after that's going to be medical issues that are very nuanced, very difficult to understand, and this jury is going to have to follow along and then make sense of all of it. But at the end of the day, the state made clear and the defense made clear that we have 2 experts. One's the medical examiner and one's an expert that's paid by the state. And we're going to have to decide between the 2 what the cause of death was in this case. And that is not an easy issue to resolve.